OctOSR, sometimes also referred to as OSR October or OSR Tober, is a month-long celebration of OSR styles of play. That is, play that grew out of the OSR movement. Old school rules, old school renaissance, old school revolution. Just as there's not really an agreement of what this month is called, there's also not an agreement of what the R is in OSR. There's also not full agreement among what OSR gaming means. Largely, it's split into two schools of thought, one being that it's play that is derived from using TSR era fantasy rules, D&D, OD&D, AD&D, BX or BECME, or second edition AD&D, though some OSR people do not consider second edition part of the movement. But the other major split within what OSR gaming means is simply how you play the game, the style with which you play the game, with certain principles that you apply to gaming that make it old school. For OctOSR, I'm focusing on this second aspect of OSR gaming, the principles with which the game is played, regardless of the rule set you use. That's as succinct an explanation as I can give you of what OSR is, so I hope you enjoy. In this episode, I'm going to focus on a frequently mentioned aspect of OSR gaming that you'll hear pretty much from anyone that plays in the OSR at some point, regardless of their view on what is OSR. And one of the first mentions of what is probably a foundational aspect of OSR gaming could be found in a document called A Quick Primer for Old School Gaming by Matt Finch. This document goes back to the earliest foundations of the OSR movement and is largely based around what is referred to in the document as 4 Zen moments. And the one I'm going to talk about today is rulings, not rules. All right, this episode was inspired by a video that came up as one of the suggested videos on my feed in YouTube one day. And this is from a channel called Anvil Worldbuilding. And the name of the video is OSR RPGs, a quick guide to old school games. So obviously, this being OctOSR, I was interested in what this take was that was popping up in October because it was a video of just a few days ago at the time that I'm recording this. And it was just a few minutes. I don't remember if it was 5, 6, 7 minutes. It wasn't very long. And it was one of those videos that if you go down to the bottom of the video and you kind of put your mouse on it, if you're watching on a computer, you can see that there are segments to the video, and you can see that they're, essentially chapter titles to them. And the names of those chapter titles were Rules Light, Player Agency, Deadly Combat, Exploration, and Retro Aesthetics. And I think there were a couple at the end. And of course, there was like an intro at the beginning, and there were a couple of other things at the end that were just kind of wrapping things up. And during the initial talk about the rules light portion of it, the phrase rulings over rules was mentioned again. And in the player agency section, resource management was talked about. And then when it got to the exploration section, I think the exact phrase was, and I'll try to write it down here so I remember, is that OSR games were all about discovering the unknown, confronting the unexpected, and that the hex crawl was a mainstay of the OSR style play, utilizing random tables so that a lot of times even the game master wouldn't know what's going to happen next. So breaking some of these down, you can immediately see some of the influences of the 4 Zen moments that I talked about on the couple previous episodes of OctOSR this year. Rules Light, that, as I said, they mentioned rulings over rules as part of that. Player agency, that can equate a lot to player skill, not character ability. It's not a complete overlap, but it's similarity, I guess is the word I'm looking for. Deadly Combat equates a lot to that heroic, not super heroic aspect, as well as forgetting game balance. That also falls into that. Now, Rules Light is something that when I was looking at topics to cover in OctOSR, was something that I had kind of categorized as spin-off of OSR, kind of OSR adjacent, along with low prep, no prep GMing, which goes into sort of the part of the exploration part in the video where they talked about the random tables in the hex crawl and how the GM didn't necessarily know what was going to happen any more than the players did at the time. And I don't want to confuse anybody. The video doesn't actually talk about low prep, no prep, but to me, that and the rules light notion kind of go hand in hand because, well, I mean, if you're low prep, no prep, you're probably not using a heavy rule set, a lot of rules. I think both of these things are, as I said, I think they're more of a spin-off of the OSR movement. I don't know that if you look at the old school rules, particularly of D&D, that you're going to find that they're rules light in particular. And certainly I don't think they're low prep, no prep. There are tools in some tables and stuff that you could use to be low prep, no prep. But when you look at the advice given or the procedures given, whether you go to the BX or BECME rules, the basic sets, where it talks about how to set up a dungeon, it's saying choose a scenario, decide on a setting, choose special monsters, stock the dungeon, draw the map. In the original D&D, in the third book, it says, it is advisable to construct at least 3 levels of a dungeon at once. And of course, in AD&D, Gary devotes, like 100 pages of that book of just different ideas on how to be a dungeon master and suggesting several times throughout the way that, yeah, you can do this randomly or you can pick randomly, but it's better to place things specifically, particularly when talking about magic items and monsters and how to deal with, the first few levels of a dungeon. And maybe to a lot of people that's low prep, but to me that doesn't sound like low prep. And as far as rules light goes, like I said, Gary devoted 100 pages of the Dungeon Master's Guide to giving you rules and procedures and ideas to follow. And that's not counting the pages of magic items and things like that. And the player's handbook, similarly for AD&D, is like that. Yes, there's a lot of pages devoted to spells and everything, but there's a lot of pages of just rules. And even the original 3 little brown books are, they're about 40 pages each. And BX and BECME, I mean, they're all fairly hefty. I mean, if you picked up a game, if you went and picked up a random board game, a random card game, and a random role-playing game, the role-playing games have more rules. They just do. I mean, I've played in my time some fairly complex and rules-heavy war games that probably didn't have 60 pages of rules, 40, 50, 60 pages of rules, the way the original role-playing games did. But again, that may seem rules light to other people in the RPG community. It just doesn't seem that way to me. Another thing I found interesting about the video was the idea of the hex crawl is the mainstay. And again, hex crawl is one of those things that I do think is something that is intimately tied with OSR play. But I think if you go back to the original games, they always defined the early establishing an RPG, establishing a campaign is starting with a dungeon, and at least setting up the first level or the first several levels of that dungeon before going into play. So while I think a hex crawl is very much part of OSR style gaming, I think it's a later part of OSR style gaming. If you're talking about adventuring with a group for the first time, with new players or new DM or both, I think in the OSR style, it's always been, start with a dungeon, simply because it is more contained. It's something you put together ahead of time, whether you're grabbing it from a module or from an event or a bought adventure, so to speak, or setting up yourself. It's something that is more limited in scope so that everyone involved can get the feel for the campaign or the feel for each other or simply the feel for playing the game. But I do think the concept of exploration, even though that video they tie it, I think, a lot more to random tables and the hex crawl. I think the idea of discovering the unknown, confronting the unexpected, exploration is a key aspect of OSR play, of exploring the world with your wits, what few things your characters are capable of, and whatever your characters are carrying with them into an unknown set of challenges or an unknown set of dangers is essentially OSR. So it was an interesting video. I don't know that I agreed that everything in that video was, essential, was, basic foundation OSR. But I think there was a lot of, yes, this is OSR or OSR adjacent. So I put a link to it in the show notes. As I said, it's from the Anvil Worldbuilding channel. It's called OSR RPGs, a quick guide to old school games. If you have any feedback on this episode, you can contact me by email at phantomthoughtspodcast@gmail.com, on my Google Voice number, 864-209-1441, on my SpeakPipe link at www.speakpipe.com/phantomthoughts, or via Discord. My profile is The Pink Phantom. Or you can leave a comment on the YouTube channel, youtube.com/@phantomthoughtspodcast.